Mahala with Mass DEP.
Good morning. My name's Jim Mahala. I'm with Mass DEP. I'm also here with Purvi Patel with the MEPA office. We're conducting a joint MEPA DEP on-site inspection today. This is an informal meeting for us to see the site, to hear from the proponents, to hear from the Town Conservation Commission, and then to open it up to the public in general for comment. We have a very large crowd today, so I would urge people to submit comments in writing to MEPA in terms of their review. Our office will also accept comments on the project under the Wetlands Act and under the Wetlands Protection Act. But this is, so I would just want to introduce Purvi. She'll explain the MEPA review process, and we'll move on from there.
My name is Purvi Patel with the MEPA office. I represent Secretary Mava Lily Bartlett on behalf of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We're here because this project exceeds certain MEPA review thresholds, namely the alteration of coastal bank and the alteration of greater than 1/2 acre of other wetland resource areas, in this case coastal beach. We're here also because this project requires a state agency action, and that only action is the superseding order of conditions with the Mass DEP. So that's why Jim and I are holding this meeting jointly. He'll tend to lead the meeting because of this is only there's only one action that's required for this project. But I want to let you know that briefly, the MEPA review is not a permitting process. What MEPA review is about is it's a review process that seeks to have the proponents and commenters look at the project and identify ways that they can avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts that are project related. So while I take notes, this is not a public hearing. I don't record what you say, and if you want your comments to be submitted for the record, they need to be submitted to the MEPA office. I can provide you with the details. They're on our website, the MEPA office. I can give you my email address. That's the preferable mode of commenting. Comments have been extended for this project and are due in writing by Tuesday, September 9th, and the certificate will be issued on Friday, September 19th. Okay, so thank you for your attendance here, and if you could just come in a little bit from the roadway so you can be safe and we don't have to worry about you being struck by a vehicle. Okay, so that's the role of MEPA, and it requires a state agency action and it exceeds the MEPA review threshold. Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to turn it over to the proponents, which is the Sconset Beach Preservation Fund, and they'll give a brief project overview, description. At that point, when they're finished, I'd like to turn it over to the Conservation Commission to hear their position on the project and their concerns and their reasons for denying the order of conditions. Once that's concluded, we'll open it up to the general public for comment, organizations, or any concerned resident in the town. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Maria Hartnett with Epsilon Associates, who will be giving a brief project overview. And I think Josh Posner might have a word or two to say first.
Just briefly, some housekeeping issues. We're so happy we have a nice day today. There is water in a cooler in the back if people want water. There's some granola bars. We are so happy to see so many supporters of the Sconset Beach Preservation Fund and the Geotube project wearing red "Retreat Will Not Save Sconset" stickers. And I just thought I would give everybody a chance to wave their hand and say hello to DEP. Once again, please stay out of the road and keep yourself safe. And now Maria.
Good morning. I am Maria Hartnett. I'm from Epsilon Associates. We are the permitting consultant for this project, and I have been asked to give you an overview of the project. Since it does have a long history, I will be taking a few minutes to do that, but I will try to move through briefly so we have plenty of time for other comments. I'll be taking you through an overview of the project, the permitting history, and some of its monitoring and mitigation commitments. I'll be describing how there is a certified emergency in the project area. I'll be describing how the project includes mitigation that's in excess of the state standard. And I'll be telling you about the project's monitoring system and how the project includes failure criteria and how the project has already funded an escrow account that will allow the project to be removed if it becomes necessary. And I'll also be showing you why we feel the project is consistent with the Wetlands Protection Act performance standards and why we feel that any outstanding issues can be resolved through the SOC process. So starting with the project overview, hopefully you've had a chance to take a look over the bluff and see the project. What you see there was authorized under an emergency certification request issued to SBPF by the Conservation Commission back in December. The project was constructed in December 2013 and January 2014, and it consists of 3 rows of stacked geotextile tubes with a sand cover on it. The project was required to file a notice of intent, which was subsequently denied, and then SBPF requested a superseding order of conditions, which is why we're here today. As Porvi said, the project does exceed some MEPA review thresholds. The project does only require one single state permit, and so MEPA jurisdiction for this project is limited to the subject matter of that state permit, or in other words, it's limited to wetlands issues. Some of the purposes of MEPA review, it's typically done at the beginning of a project before it's been built, and some of its purposes are to facilitate agency coordination when multiple permits are required, so that's not really the case here. And it also allows all the environmental issues to be identified. As many of you know, the project has had multiple hearings over several months, and so we do feel that the environmental issues for the project are well understood. And for all these reasons, we believe that any outstanding issues can be resolved through the SOC process, and that no further MEPA review beyond an ENF is needed. So that's the project overview. I do want to spend just a couple of minutes taking you through the project's permitting history, since it is a lengthy process that led us to this point. First, I want to start with the need for the project. As you can see, the ocean is right there, and as many of you being homeowners here, you know and saw that the winter of 2012 to 2013 really led to some devastating erosion. Folks were losing 20 to 30 feet, maybe a little bit more. This erosion left pre-1708 homes within as close as 5 to 10 feet from the top of the bank, and the roadway in certain spots was only about 30 feet from the top of the bank, and in others 40 or to 50 feet. And because of this situation, it was found that even another significant storm could render Baxter Road impassable. It could breach the water and sewer supply and leave all those residences north of here stranded without water or sewer service. We would also lose our access to the lighthouse. A geotechnical engineer advised the town that once the edge of the road got within 25 feet, the road would need to be closed so that there could be further evaluation to see if it was safe to maintain travel. And town council also advised the town that they had a legal obligation to maintain access to the residents on Baxter Road. And so because of this, the town of Nantucket and SBPF partnered together. This partnership originally took the form of a revetment notice of intent that was filed in July of 2013. After several months of hearings, the winter storm season was approaching, and it became clear that this could not be permitted and constructed in time. So a new notice of intent was filed in October for a geotube project. Again, there were several hearings on this, and the winter storm season was approaching, and a decision had not yet been reached. So in November, SBPF filed an emergency certification request for 4 rows of geotextile tubes. This was denied by the Conservation Commission, and SBPF appealed to DEP. While DEP was making their determination on this emergency certification request, the town of Nantucket filed their own emergency certification request, and this project it was what's called a hybrid project, where the lower 2 tiers would be geotextile tubes, and the upper tiers would be composed of a biodegradable jute or core material. This was approved. And so DEP also approved SBPF's request for 4 tiers of geotextile tubes, but also asked us to increase the sand mitigation requirement. The typical sand mitigation requirement is to provide what the bank would normally provide through erosion on an annual basis. DEP requested that this mitigation be increased to 1.5 times the natural erosion rate, and DEP specifically said that this would mitigate any differences between the town's hybrid proposal and SBPF's 4-tier GEO2 proposal. So now the different iterations of the project had 2 different active approved emergency certification requests, and so SBPF and the town partnered together again to try to reconcile the differences, and they submitted another emergency certification request to the town for the 4 tiers of geotextile tubes, but with the increased mitigation amount that DEP had recommended. And this was approved by the Conservation Commission. However, only 3 tiers of geotextile tubes were approved. And so it was this approval that led to the project being built. So that's a long history. So now I just want to get through briefly describing to you what the project includes. And there are some slight difference between what has been constructed and what has been proposed. So I have some plans here. I'll take you through those briefly. Stephen, do you mind helping hold these? I know the wind is blowing and it's hard to see. I just wanted to let you know that I will have these plans available for anyone who wants to take a closer look at them. The main thing I wanted to point out is that the project extent, it's about 850 feet in length from 87 up to the clay head at 105, and it consists of 3 tiers of stacked geotextile tubes. The lowest geotextile tube is buried beneath the beach, and then the other 2 are stacked on top of it. So when we're looking at overall height, the geotextile tubes that are there now are about 10 to 12 feet above the base of the bluff. And then there's a substantial sand cover on top of that. Again, we went through the calculation. We calculated that the bank on average contributes 14.3 cubic yards per linear foot per year. And DEP requested that we increase that to 1.5 times that amount, which is about 22 cubic yards per linear foot of sand. So there is a substantial sand cover down there that you can see over the edge. We don't know of any other project that provides mitigation at this amount. So that is a description of what has been built. You can see the cross-section here and just the extent. I'll make you And the primary, there's just a couple of things that we requested to be added. As part of the emergency certification approval, we were required to file a notice of intent after the fact. And so we determined to use the October 2013 notice of intent that we had filed, but then we also updated it in a few ways. So there are some additional things that we are requesting. This was first requested to the Conservation Commission. When that was denied, it is now going to DEP through the request for a superseding order of condition. So the primary thing that's being requested, you can see here, is a 4th row of geotextile tubes. This was our proposal all along. It's based on the coastal engineering analyses and design criteria for the project area. This was approved by DEP in their emergency certification request. Also, this shaded area here, it represents that we want to vegetate the upper bluff. This vegetation will help us deal with some of the surface water runoff, and wave and wind-induced erosion. We plan to plant American beach grass first and then some native woody shrubs. And we'll leave the upper 5 to 7 feet unvegetated to allow for swallows nesting. Swallows aren't a listed species, but it was a concern expressed during the hearing, so we're willing to maintain the upper 5 to 7 feet. For the vegetation to be successful, the bank face, if you've seen it, it's really rutted. There's a lot of gullies, so we need to put a little bit of sand down just to smooth it out a little bit and give the plants a better chance at growing successfully. The other component we're asking for is, you can see right here at the end, these are called returns. You put them at the end of the geotextile tubes to prevent flanking of the system. These will consist of smaller 15-foot circumference geotextile tubes. We don't need to excavate into the bank to install them. Those are the main components. And then one other outstanding component is the surface water drain. Couple lots down at 91 Baxter Road, a big gully was forming during construction. I think we have something similar right here behind us. And the gully was, again, threatening the road. And SBPS contractor discussed the issue with the advising geotechnical engineer, who recommended that a surface water drain be installed to handle the runoff issue. He suggested that the drain consist of a stone-filled trench parallel to Baxter Road for about 41 feet that would connect to a pipe that would collect the surface water runoff and carry it down the face of the bank so that it wouldn't break out on the face of the bank. And due to construction timing, there was a need to get the pipe installed before the sand template went in so that we wouldn't have to excavate. This was installed without a permit. SBPS council did ask for an enforcement order to be issued. An enforcement order was issued, and the Concom later directed that this could be resolved through the notice of intent process. But again, with the denial and the appeal, this is still an open issue, and so it's now with DEP through the request for a superseding order. There's clearly a need for some surface water improvements here, and so we do believe the drain would be beneficial to bluff stability, but SBPF recognizes this wasn't done the way it should be, and so they said they're willing to abandon it in place or take it out. The pipe was capped, so it's never functioned as a drain. Yeah. Okay, Stephen asked me to remind folks why we need the fourth tube. Again, this is based on coastal engineering analyses. The project is being designed for a 100-year storm based on the wave data that we have from some of the offshore buoys. And during a 100-year storm, it's expected that the storm surge, which is one of the most devastating impacts of storms, that it will come and be about at the level 4 to 6 feet above the base of the bluff. So storm surge is expected to drive the water that high. And then on top of that, there will be wave run-up. So the waves will be hitting the geotube structure and then running up, or hitting the unprotected bluff and running up an additional 10 feet. And so in order to adequately protect this area from a 100-year storm, we need to get our elevation up to the level of the fourth tier shown here. Without that fourth tier, if we are forced to remain at the current only 3 rows of geotextile tubes, if a large enough storm comes, this system will be overtopped and the bank could still erode behind it and the system could fail. So we do feel there is a strong need for that fourth tier because of the coastal storm surge conditions and run-up that can be expected during a large storm at the project area. Okay, thank you. We can set those down. I just have a couple more things to go over with you. I really wanted to talk about the project's impacts, monitoring, and mitigation, because that's why many of us are here, because of very legitimate concerns about the potential impacts of the project. So I'd say the number one potential impact from the project is we all understand this bluff erodes and it supplies sand to the littoral system. We know that and we recognize that. Again, we very painstakingly calculated what volume this bank typically provides. We corroborated that with survey data. We corroborated it with shoreline change data. We actually did the calculation 3 different ways and we came up with very similar answers. And then in accordance with the guidance provided by DEP, we increased the mitigation volume, and in the guidance provided by the Commission, we increased the volume to 22 cubic yards per linear foot. So we're now at 1.5 times what the bank typically provides. This is a big commitment and should serve to mitigate any adverse impacts from the project. We've also talked about how this sand is available to the littoral system. The project has had one major storm on March 26th. And we feel that the sand mitigation that we've put out there is available. Again, the geotubes, they stick out onto the beach a little bit, so the sand is a little farther seaward. And during the storm on March 26th, we found that as designed, the sand cover lost sand. We lost 1.5 to 2.5 cubic yards per linear foot. We checked the terraces nearby, and they lost 1/4 of a cubic yard. And the unprotected bank didn't lose very much at all. So during this storm, we found that the project did lose more sand than the terraces, and so it was a good indication that this mitigation sand is going to be available and will be doing its job of being eroded during storms. We're also going to be continuing the shoreline monitoring program. This is one of the best monitored shorelines in the state. We have over 20 years of baseline data here. The surveys will continue in the spring and in the fall. In the spring, we'll be getting out to about -5 mean low water, so we'll be getting the near shore. And in the fall, we'll be doing bathymetry. We'll be going several thousand feet offshore. And those surveys will continue, and that's for a section of about 5 miles of shoreline from Wawinit at the north down to the sewer beds. And we'll also be monitoring the top of the bank right near the project's ends. We'll be monitoring after storms. Again, we did this on March 26th. We went out, we took a look. We saw that the sand cover had eroded as designed. The geotubes had performed well, no damage to them, and the bank was also protected. We've also offered to do underwater video monitoring if that's required. And most importantly, we proposed failure criteria. So failure for the criteria, we have described these as if we fail to do the monitoring, if we fail to provide mitigation, if we fail to maintain the geotubes, or if there's an excessive change in adjacent shorelines that can be attributed to the project. And again, understanding one of the principal concerns for this project, we will be monitoring the shoreline very carefully to look for impacts that are different from baseline conditions. One example I wanted to bring up is that there are certain coastal engineering structures that interfere with littoral transport, like groins or jetties. The impacts from those are seen right nearby. And although this project is not like those, we're not cutting off littoral transport and we are providing mitigation, we do still expect that we will see any impacts right nearby first. And because of that, we are monitoring the ends of the system very intensively. It's kind of like our early warning system. We really do expect to pick up impacts right at the ends first. And of course, we'll be monitoring the whole thing and checking the whole thing, but I did want to explain that we are very much checking those ends very, very closely to see if any early impacts are showing up. And if they do, this could trigger failure, and in turn, that could trigger the system removal. There are also a couple of proposed failure criteria related to maintaining a beach width, or if there are impacts to underwater habitats. And finally, for project removal, I did want to stress that SBPF has already funded an escrow account. This is in place, and so again, if we reach the point where the project needs to be removed, we've shown that it can be removed readily, and the funds are in place to do so. I had just a couple more things I wanted to discuss. Very briefly on alternatives, the ENF has a very long section about all the alternatives that have been evaluated over the years, things that have either been done here or evaluated in practice. I just wanted to touch briefly on one alternative that was discussed quite a bit during the hearings, which was the use of core or jute materials. As many of you know, that jute terraces have been in use for a number of years, especially right down the street at 79 Baxter, but they are designed to lose their sand during storms. They leave the bank vulnerable after they lose their sand, and they have to be replaced 1 to 3 times a year. All the engineering analyses have shown that they would fail during a major storm if they were used for this project right here. At 79 Baxter Road, failure resulted in some pretty big losses of bank. The terraces had been regularly maintained, and they had done a pretty good job in some of the smaller storms, but during the winter of 2012 to 2013, we had a series of big storms and successive storms. The terraces lost their sand, which we all knew they were going to do, but they couldn't be replaced, and so the homeowner there lost nearly 30 feet of bank at the northern end of his property. And because in this location, we don't have 30 feet of bank to lose, we have so little area before the road needs to be closed, we really feel that this is simply an infeasible option for the project area. We know it's going to fail, and we just don't feel it's worth the risk here. We also feel that when DEP approved the 4-tier geotextile project, they specifically stated that requiring additional sand mitigation would mitigate any differences between the 4-tier geotextile tube project and a hybrid project. So we feel that the volume of sand we have out there already more than compensates for any sand, the small amount of sand that would be released from a jute or core terrace. And finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on was just regulatory compliance. We do feel that we are in compliance with the Wetlands Protection Act standards. The project did receive a denial order conditions by the Nantucket Conservation Commission. That's included in the ENF. The denial cited all applicable performance standards for the project. I think there were about 14. and found that the project had not met the burden of proof for any of these standards. The denial didn't provide the basis upon which these findings were made, and there wasn't anything in writing, no specific objections to any of the calculations we had done, or our failure criteria, or our monitoring protocols. The denial simply stated that no conditions can be set for the project that would adequately protect wetland resources. And we just feel that this denial is inconsistent with the CONCOM's earlier findings. When the CONCOM approved the emergency certification request, they found that the road is in imminent danger, that failure of the road would be a risk to public health and safety, and that the project as designed is necessary to abate the emergency. We also thought that the findings in the denial that the project did not meet any performance standards and could not be conditioned to meet any performance standards was inconsistent with DEP's earlier findings, that the project was consistent with at least some of the performance standards. DEP cited those performance standards in approving the project. And in our request for superseding order of condition and in the ENF, we've gone through every single performance standard. I especially wanted to highlight one of the state performance standards, 310 CMR 10.303. It allows for coastal engineering structures to protect pre-1978 buildings, and DEP cited this when they approved the earlier emergency certification request for 4 tiers of geotextile tubes. So in conclusion, I just wanted to again point out there is a certified emergency here in the project area. There are pre-1978 homes that need to be protected, as well as essential public infrastructure that serves those homes. The project includes a substantial sand mitigation program. We have a monitoring program. We have failure criteria, and we have also already funded an escrow account that will allow the project to be taken out if it's deemed necessary. This project, either in 3 tiers or 4 tiers, the design was already found as being necessary to abate the emergency. And we feel that the project is consistent and has been shown to be consistent with the Wetlands Protection Act standards. And finally, we also feel that because this project only requires 1 state permit, that there's not a lot of need for additional MEPA review beyond the ENF. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. Why don't we turn it over to the Nantucket Conservation Commission? Jeff Carlson, the administrator, is here, and several members of the commission, so we'll give them an opportunity to speak.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Carlson. As Mr. Mahala said, I'm the Natural Resources Coordinator for the town and the Direct Administrator for the Conservation Commission. Real quick before I get started, just wanted to say a big thank you again to everyone for coming this morning, but more importantly of all, wanted to thank the commission and the board members for spending what is really probably the longest set of hearings that I can remember being a part of, and really taking the time and energy to put forward and try to make the best decision that they could put forward. So I will try to explain and go through some of the steps that we went through administratively for us and how we kind of arrived to the decision that we were there, and spell it out that way. So just to be clear, the CONCOM did issue a denial order of conditions as it relates to the GO2 project that Ms. Hartnett so clearly presented. There were a number of factors that went into that reasoning and that decision making. And before I get to the specifics of the decision, I also would just like to clarify that an emergency certification was granted in the late winter and kind of early spring through December and January for the project that's constructed. However, when we're evaluating as a commission, we're evaluating emergency certifications as opposed to a notice of intent and order of conditions. There are different standards that apply and a different level of review that's there. And I think what's important is to obviously abate your emergency with the emergency, and then to also normalize and get a project that complies to performance standards to be the ultimate project that remains. I think that's one of the things that are there. I may take questions at the end, but that's kind of at the discretion of Mr. Mahala. So real quickly, there were 3 main factors to the Talk closer to the mic. No problem. I'll try to talk a little closer. Sorry about that, Bob. So there were a number of 3 main decisions that kind of came from the commission and some findings that came out to bear that decision. First and foremost, I'd just like to clarify that we're not just dealing with a coastal bank as resource areas on this site. We have a number of resource areas. We have coastal bank, which is the most obvious. It's the eroding face that's here. But we're also dealing with coastal beach, land subject to coastal storm flowage. And then we're also dealing with, through the performance standards of coastal beach, dealing with the performance standards with land under the ocean as well. So those are the 4 primary resource areas that the Commission was dealing with in review of the GEO2 project. And just to be doubly clear, there are also vegetated wetlands on portions of the sites across Baxter Road that buffer zones come across, but they're not really applicable to this review or to this specific project. Going forward in review of their performance standards, there were really 3 main pieces that the Commission discussed at great length as far as what complied to the performance standards and what didn't comply to the performance standards. And I'll just kind of step through one by one. The first one is the Commission found that the structure that was being proposed and the structure that's constructed right now is a coastal engineering structure. That's an important determination for the Conservation Commission because the performance standards, especially as they apply to pre- and post-78 homes, and the other performance standards are reliant upon a determination of the Commission on whether or not this is a coastal engineering structure or is not a coastal engineering structure. So in this case, they did determine it to be a coastal engineering structure. So going forward, that's an important part of the review. The first piece that they determined to be applicable in this case is the use of a coastal engineering structure to protect pre- and post-78 homes. So the State Act distinguishes between the ability to protect pre-78 structures to be able to have coastal engineering structures or not. So when the Commission reviewed the project area that's there, there are obviously a number of vacant parcels of land. There are areas that have pre-78 and some post-78 homes. And when the Commission was reviewing that as it related to the coastal bank, they felt that the coastal engineering structure was not permissible in front of lots that did not qualify for protection under the State Act by having a pre-78 home. So just as an example, the lot that we're standing on right now is within the project area, is a vacant lot, and they felt that this lot would be a lot that did not qualify for protection under the State Act. Secondly, when we reviewed the project, we also are looking at adverse impacts of the project, not only on the coastal bank and the eroding that's there, but also at the coastal beach land subject to coastal storm flowage, and then the adjacent areas updrift and downdrift. So the Commission spent great time to deal with the mitigation volumes that were there, looking at the mitigation volumes to not just include the bank, but to also include the beach. The beach is obviously heavily impacted by this project. There's a geotube within the coastal beach. And then obviously through just regular sand transport, just the coastal dynamics, water comes up, takes the sand from the beach and from the bank, comes back across the beach before it goes back out onto land under the ocean. So when we're looking at that mitigation volume that's there, the Commission felt it was important to include that beach component or to look at what that beach component contributes to the littoral system as we're looking forward to it. So the Commission's review of that concluded that the project that was proposed was not adequately mitigating for the loss of bank, beach, and then also for the impacts both updrift and downdrift of the littoral system. This bank is a very large bank, and this bank was determined by the Commission to both be a bank for a sediment source and also as a vertical barrier to storms, the 2 distinctions that the State Act makes and what it is. And they felt that the mitigation component that was in place, coupled with the structure that was beneath, did not adequately protect the interest of the State Act as it related to those adverse effects. One of the things that's interesting about that is we had a very interesting case this time. Very rarely are we dealing with permitting a structure that's in existence and is on the ground, in a structure that you can really view and a structure that you can see. So it's my first experience with the project, at least with the Commission, that commissioners are going out on a daily basis or photos are getting posted on a daily basis where you're really getting to see what the structure's doing and how the structure's really behaving while you're discussing its merits and trying to permit or not to permit a structure. So discussing the storm a little bit at March 26th, one of the interesting things about that is it did show us a number of things that were discussed by the Commission, one of which was the function of the structure. And it was interesting to see, and the Commission discussed it at great length, that the structure, as it was functioning through that storm, did release sand. I don't think there was any dispute from the Commission that was there, but one of the great points of debate amongst the commissioners were a section of the geotubes exposed. So the top of the bottom tier exposed, and then the face of about the upper quarter of the structure and the middle tube also exposed, and the sand template eroded, and it really gave us a really great kind of 24 to 48 hour case study on how that sand template is going to function, and then how the structure functions when the sand template is either eroded away or is maintained. So in this case, we had a nice study where 3/4 of the structure had let go sand and was still covering the tubes, but the other quarter was partially exposed. And one of the great points of discussion was what impacts were caused to the beach that was facing, to the structure itself, to the sand that goes updrift and downdrift from the section of geotubes that exposed. And the section that was there that was not providing sand for a certain amount of time, and what those impacts may have been or what they could have been. I know it's also very difficult to, in one storm, get a really complete view of what's happening, but I think it gave us a really brief shot on how it was functioning as compared to how it was designed to function, and what those potential impacts may be, or if that mitigation volume is appropriately placed, if it's appropriately formed, if it's appropriately designed to fall down in the storms. And I think the commission, through their determination, determined that the structure was not functioning in the best interest of the interest in the bylaw as it was sitting on the ground, just based upon kind of that episodic snapshot that we were dealing with. So that was one of the other main components, were those adverse impacts and adverse effects that were there. The third real important point that was probably discussed the most amongst the commission was the ability to have a reasonable alternative or another alternative design. And I think through the process altogether, one of the things that we saw through the multiple emergency hearings were the creativity of both the applicant and the commission and the town to come forward and try to put the best design forward possible that could function, not provide those impacts and what's there. And I think ultimately the commission, going through it, determined, based upon what they had seen in the field, what was there, what's been historically permitted on Baxter Road with multiple projects, all the way back to the dewatering projects and the terraces and jute and core logs and dune guard fencing and all of the projects that came along, that through the process that there were reasonable alternatives that would protect the interest protected by the act in this case, or those avenues hadn't been explored enough to essentially rule out as being reasonable alternatives. And I think they went to great length to discuss both any combination. In this case, it was mostly discussions relating to biodegradable materials like jute or core, but also to look at hybrid designs or alternative designs, or to look at obviously how different lots qualify for different coastal engineering structures from the pre-78 qualification, whether or not that structure could fit those standards a little bit better. And ultimately the commission decided that there were reasonable alternatives, and actually for all of the findings that they did, this was one that they actually had a specific vote amongst the commissioners that there were reasonable alternatives to the project that was proposed, whether it's the 3 geotubes or the 4th geotube that's now come in the later proposal here, that they felt that there were alternatives that were reasonable that had not been explored to go to this level of structure. Those were the 3 main points that led to their decision. So when they discuss it in their order of conditions, they were relating to the applicant's ability to not meet the burden of proof to demonstrate compliance with those resource areas, specifically the bank, the beach, land subject to coastal storm flowage, and land under the ocean ultimately. That all of those things in totality led up to the applicant not meeting the burden of proof to demonstrate their compliance with these standards, or they didn't feel they had the ability to condition the project as it was proposed to meet those standards. And that's kind of the commission in the nutshell for how they got to where they were. I don't know if I'm supposed to take questions or if commissioners would like to add anything.
I just have one question. Who are the applicants on the NOI?
Sure. So the applicants on this specific notice of intent were the Sconset Beach Preservation Fund and the town of Nantucket. It was a joint application.
So just to be clear, so Concom turned down a project that the town was a co-applicant.
I would say the Conservation Commission reviews all projects based solely upon performance standards, and they felt that it didn't meet the performance standards.
Got it. Thank you.
Correct. And just Mr. Pucci just clarified for me, the other part of the co-application is the agreement for the co-application included the provision that the application ultimately get permitted and reviewed with a positive order from the Conservation Commission. So that was a key component to that. Sure.
I just have a question about this lot. Before the house was moved off this lot, wasn't it a pre-1978 house?
Could you repeat the question, please?
I just have a question about this lot. Apparently, this lot does not qualify under the Act because it doesn't have a pre-1978 home on it. But my question is, before the bluff eroded so much that caused the house to be moved, wasn't the house on here a pre-1978 house?
Great point.
I don't know the answer to that, but we just to be clear, we deal with conditions that are current to the ground in our review of the project and current conditions that are there. Whether there was something here 100 years ago or yesterday, we deal with site conditions that are current, resource area delineations that are current.
Is that the intention of the law, do you believe? That if the house gets moved because we're not protecting the bluff, then suddenly we don't have to protect the bluff anymore? Do you think that's the intention of the law? I'm just curious.
I would say that's not my question to answer.
Okay.
I've got the microphone, so I'm going to ask a question. Do you? Thank you for getting it to me. So you only look at lots. My house is on the other side of the street, so it's a pre-1978 house. Do you not look at the houses on the other side of the street, or you just look at a lot?
Sure, so I'll try to answer that, and if everyone could, and I'll ask you to do it really quickly. If you get up to ask a question, if you could please just say your name.
Mary
That would be great for
McAuliffe. Mary
our-
McAuliffe, 72 Baxter.
Excellent, thank you. So to answer your question, the area of the commission's jurisdiction is kind of limited by a number of things. One of the things our jurisdiction is limited to is the area around the resource area and then the area within 100 feet of the resource area. That's the bounds of the commission's jurisdiction. We're not legally able to really review areas that are outside of the 100-foot buffer zone. We can't condition those areas. We can't permit those areas. So our review is kind of limited to that area. Certainly, community dynamics and things that are there obviously play an important part in discussions that are there, but we still are bound to the performance standards that are set by both the state act, in this case what we're talking about today, and then also the local wetlands protection bylaw.
Go ahead, it's on.
It's on? All right. It just relates to this lot specifically. This house, pre-78, was not moved. It was raised. That's number one. Next door was moved. Number two, I would like to draw your attention to the house over there, which is my house. Yeah, it's across the street, and I am obviously expressing some amount of concern of your comments of why this strip should not be protected when this is fairly close. I don't know how close it is, but it's close to Baxter Road, and it looks like my house is 1.5 miles away, but it ain't. So perhaps you could just speak to that point?
Sure, can I get your name, sir, for the record again?
I'm sorry, Larry Guido, and I live at 90 Baxter.
Excellent, thank you, Larry. So to answer that question again, with the review of the commission is very bound to the language of the law, and the law in this case, in our jurisdictional area. So the law in this case specifically says in the act that we deal with lots in coastal engineering structures as it relates to pre-78 buildings that are within our jurisdiction. At this point, I'm just speculating and guessing, I probably shouldn't, that you're outside of our jurisdictional region.
These are very good questions, and these are questions that DEP will be considering in our review of the project under appeal. I don't think we're here today to look at each individual lot and say this project, this lot qualifies for a pre-70 for a coastal engineering structure or not. I think DEP will be considering the facts as they exist in their entirety. If there's a pre-78 house across the street, those facts are in their application, and they will be considered in the review of the project in its entirety. But I don't think we're necessarily out here to say what's lot 91, what's lot 105, and I think it's a little bit unfair for Jeff to be questions specifically of this particular lot, but rather we would look at the entire project, whether or not there are pre-78 buildings either across the street or on the seaward side of the street when we review the project, in its entirety. So I just wanted to sort of get Jeff off the hot seat and sort of also just explain, we're not here to determine whether or not this permit's going to be issued. We're out here to hear the concerns, to hear the folks who live across the street who want to be heard as well. So I just want to say that. Yeah, I think once the Conservation Commission has felt that they've had an opportunity to convey their feelings on the project, what I would like to do is open it up to the public in general. There's a lot of people here, so I am a little bit concerned about how much time that might take. So I will urge you again to, if you feel strongly, to submit your comments in writing. But certainly, once the commission is done, we will open it up for the public. I know the Land Council is here with a few of their, consultants. They'll have an opportunity to speak, and individuals can have an opportunity to speak as well.
So real quick, I was going to bring up Sarah Akhtai is a member of our commission. She's the vice.
Done a very good job of presenting exactly how we worked through this process. There's two additional points we might want to make. I don't know if it's part of the DEP hearing, but we also have an order of, we've denied the order of conditions based on our Nantucket bylaws, and there's two caveats to the pre-78 protection from state versus our local bylaws. And I didn't know if you wanted to explain that, and also about the substantial improvement clause.
Those are local.
So we're just discussing
Correct.
just DEP, but you might make that clear, because some people might not understand.
Sure. So what Sarah was talking about was the difference between the state act and then our local bylaw and local regulations. And again, this is a informal meeting in regard to the superseding order of conditions, which deals solely with the Wetlands Protection Act. So that discussion about local bylaw impacts is something that will be had through that appeal process. Or if people have specific questions, you can always come visit me down at our office. We can talk about how it relates to the local bylaw. But I think if we stay focused on the state act today, that would be different. But there are significant differences between the local wetlands protection bylaw and the accompanying regulations and the state wetlands protection act and its accompanying regulations.
Hi, my name is Dave Weiss, and I'm here for SBPF. And Jeff, I do not mean to put you back on the hot seat with this.
No problem.
And I appreciate the fact that you're taking questions so that we can understand better what the Conservation Commission's position was. But are you telling us that the Conservation Commission believes that the state regulations require that the pre-1978 homes be within the jurisdictional area, be within the wetlands? Is that what you're telling us?
I would say the answer to that is our jurisdictional area is bound by what's defined by the State Wetlands Protection Act. And while we can certainly review impacts that are around our jurisdictional area is what's defined by that act, and that's the area of the resource area, and then within 100 feet of that resource area is the defined jurisdictional area. Obviously, you can look at things anecdotally and look at and bring some of those interests in, but I know the commission stays focused on their specific area of jurisdiction.
So does that mean that in its considerations, the commission declined to consider protection of pre-1978 homes if they were not specifically within the wetland?
I object to a party's attorney cross-examining a...
No, I don't mean to, I really don't mean to, I just want to understand.
We'll use his answer to this question.
It's not your
in a
meeting.
superior court.
Right.
I'm sorry,
He's
Steve.
asking a question.
Sorry, Steve, but wait a minute. If you want some heated discussions, Concom's lawyers here.
You guys can make your points when you have the microphone.
No way.
It's not
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Patel.
Thank you. This is a MIPA meeting and a superseding order of condition meeting. So really, Jim and I'll decide who gets to talk, and we'll. Thank you. I appreciate your concerns, but we'll decide. It's not a public hearing, as somebody mentioned. It's not a hearing. No one's recording anything from the state level. We're just opening it up for questions and comments. And every comment that comes to the MIPA office or to the Mass DEP office has to come in writing. Okay, so I'm not sure if you're just trying to get some information from the Conservation Commission agent, but Jeff, if you want to answer it, please feel free to answer it. If you want to divert it, you can.
Good afternoon or morning. George Pucci from Town Council's office. I would just ask Jim, why don't we not have attorneys questioning or commenting? There are several good ones here around, and I promise to not talk at all if everybody just agrees. Their counsel can just confer with their clients and not turn this into a, sort of a kangaroo court.
I agree with that. This isn't a hearing. I mean, I've been in administrative hearings, and I think it's probably better off if David, if you want to make a comment, you're probably better off maybe trying to summarize what you think Jeff believes, rather than putting him on the spot in a sort of adversarial.
David, careful, the Coast Guard is showing up.
Okay, that's fine. I think it's time to move on. Jeff, I don't know if you want to speak on a little bit more on behalf of the commission, or the commission members would like to speak. I think a commission member would like to speak, so we'll give that opportunity, and then we will turn it over to the public at large.
Hi, Ernie Steinauer. I'm with the Conservation Commission. And just to comment on the 100-foot regulatory limit, if you want to give us jurisdiction over your property, come on, let us know. If you want us to regulate when you put a shed on your property, if you're within 100 foot, or when you're out of 100 foot, if you want to give us jurisdiction over what you plant in your yard, then, you're going to have to change the laws, but those limits are there to limit our authority. So we don't have jurisdiction over the whole island. We only have jurisdiction within 100 foot of a wetland. And that's to protect landowners' rights to do what they want with their property. It's not to make it hard on you, it's to make it easy on you. So just keep that in mind. That's why that limit is there. And then I comment on, I think one of the things we considered in our decision making, at least something I thought was important, was, Maria made much to do about the potential of a 100-year storm and how that would impact this bluff. And, the year of Sandy, I don't think Sandy qualified as a 100-year storm, and that took, as she said, 20 to, in some cases, up to 40 foot of the bank. But what they wanted to provide mitigation for was the average erosion rate, which was under 3 foot. So if you say the average is 3 foot, but on the 100-year storm, which they need the project for a 100-year storm, take that mitigation by 10 to get from a 3 foot average erosion rate to the 30 foot 100-year storm erosion rate. And now you're not going to have 14 cubic yards per linear foot. You're going to have, 140 cubic yards per linear foot? Halfway to the Cape or what, It did not seem consistent to say we need the project for a 100-year storm, but we want to mitigate for the average storm. If you're going to have a 100-year project, then maybe you should have a 100-year mitigation project too, but that was undoable. You just can't put that much sand on the beach. There would be no beach left. So there was these, kind of contradictions in the hearing. Another issue that came up repeatedly was the difference between the town's application, which was a temporary application to protect until they could get Baxter Road moved or to have alternate access, versus SBPF's. It sort of morphed from that, which we were permitting under the emergency order, into more of a permanent project to do long-term protection on the bank. And that caused us to look at the project in a much more stringent light. If it's going to be here for 5 years or 50 years, then we had to start thinking about these big events, the possibility that they're likely to happen, and how do we deal with that. Plus, we also heard a lot of testimony, particularly from one expert witness that talked about the release of sand and how it's important during storms that sand is continually released, and how that actually dampens wave energy. And that small storm we had in, was it March? It was a very minor nor'easter. It wasn't a full-blown storm. And it exposed it quickly eroded the sand off of the tubes, and actually exposed the scour apron in places, which was at mean low water. So even at that minor storm, we saw loss of much of the mitigation sand and loss of a lot of the beach. It took it down to mean low water, at least in places. And that wasn't even a major storm. That was not a 3-day howling nor'easter. That was a very short-term, low-impact storm. As she said, it didn't even impact the unprotected bank. So it just seemed like this project was not going to perform in a manner consistent to how this bank sort of naturally performs. And if you look at this whole bank as a system from here, which is unfortunately for the people that live here, this bank is the big sediment source for the east side of Nantucket, probably from Great Point down to Codfish Park, Low Beach. And you know, we were not able to get evidence of a project where mitigation was put in place and then to see how it performed, because they kept saying, well, it's not been done, it's not been done. So they could not substantiate that the mitigation would actually perform as advertised. There was no evidence, and it is the applicant's burden of proof to prove that there are no adverse impacts, and that's a high burden of proof, but it's required under the state and local laws. Thank you.
Okay, it sounds like the commission has had an opportunity to speak, and I appreciate that, and I thank Jeff and the commission members. A couple things I just want to touch on. It was touched on a little bit earlier about the local wetland bylaw. DEP has no jurisdiction over local wetland bylaws. That decision is only appealable to court, and DEP has no say in that process. DEP does play a role in terms of the review of an appeal under the Wetlands Act. And that's what DEP will be evaluating here, is the state standards under the Wetlands Act being applied to this project. The local bylaw permit denial is tracked in a different way. So I just want to clarify that. I just do want to clarify the standards under 10.30, which is the Coastal Bank section under the Wetlands Protection Act, which talks about coastal engineering structures being permitted when required to prevent storm damage to buildings that were constructed prior to 1978. So it requires a judgment call. I've been involved at DEP with shoreline erosion issues for 28 years. Recently, over on Chappaquiddick Island off the Vineyard, the Shifter property moved their house. They had substantial erosion out there that approached 0.8, 0.9 feet a day. So even if a building was sited over 100 feet landward, at that rate of erosion, it was only a matter of months before the house could face its demise. So the facts have to be looked at individually on a case-by-case basis. So I just want to state that as well. At this point, we can turn it over to any one of the concerned residents of the town of Nantucket. This gentleman has something he wants to say.
Sorry, I've got to go pick my daughter up, so I'm a little short on time. But my name is Doug Keppel, and I do not live on Baxter Road. I wish I lived on Baxter Road, but I live on the South Shore. I live in Nobodere. But I just wanted to make a point to the EPA. I can't make a technical point to you except 2 points. That, first of all, Baxter Road is an irreplaceable resource on Nantucket. People come to Nantucket because of the charm, the quaint nature of Baxter Road and Sconset in general. They go to see the lighthouse, they look at all of the surroundings, and this is an integral part of the fabric of Nantucket. I don't live here. I wish I lived here, but I don't. So that's the first point made by someone who lives on Nantucket, is this is an irreplaceable resource. The second point I want to make is, it sounds to me like the Concom or whoever is debating this is going through a lot of an analysis paralysis. An analysis paralysis is you look at this alternative and that alternative, and maybe this one would be better. Did you guys try that one? And in the meantime, there's a fire and the house is burning. Houses are going into the water, things are falling off the bluff, and yet we have private residents on Baxter Road and in Sconset who are willing to put up their own money to put the fire out, and you're telling them no. Well, My last point is as a taxpayer. I'm a taxpayer on Nantucket. I live on the South Shore, but I don't want to be losing the tax base as it erodes on Baxter Road. I can't imagine how many millions of dollars have already been lost during the analysis paralysis phase while these houses go into the water. I'm paying for that. If we have to bring in a private road here to service the 20 some odd houses that are going to be stranded, I'm going to pay for that. So I don't understand how anyone is gaining through any sort of an analysis paralysis as it comes to Baxter Road when you're losing an irreplaceable resource and you're asking the people of Nantucket to go ahead and pay for it. So that's my 2 cents from a guy who doesn't live on Baxter Road but would really like to someday. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bam Lafarge. I'm on the Concom. I was not on the Concom when this decision was made. I could not take part in it. But I want you to know a couple of things. And one is that the members of the Concom who voted for the denial did so in good judgment. And you can use the word analysis paralysis. I don't know where you guys were during the meeting or during last winter when I was out here every day looking at this place. And I'm not saying that the geotubes should be taken out or anything like that. I think you guys, that the Concom deserves credit for doing things in good faith. And they didn't do it because of any class difference or anything like that. They did what they believed in. Now, I've been studying, and I don't know it very well, the local wetlands or state wetlands bylaws. I don't understand it very well. There's a lot of room for interpretation. They chose that path, and I think they didn't do it for analysis paralysis. We were inflicted upon many hours of meetings. I went to all of those meetings, and I have actually for the dewatering and other things. And I think the Concom are volunteers, and they deserve your respect. Thank you.
Hi. Is this thing on? Yeah, thanks. Hi, Helmut Weimar, Baxter Road. And I certainly agree with Tam that the Concom puts in incredible hours, and that needs to be respected and admired. But I wonder, and Jeff is still around here, but as Jeff was speaking, I was we're the house where we've been steadfastly keeping terraces. It wasn't Sandy, it was the close frequency of storms that did not allow the terraces to be rebuilt during the winter of 12-13, and we lost 28 feet just by virtue of the terraces having gone away. So I wonder in that context if Jeff or Ernie or somebody could characterize the reasoning of the Concom that biodegradable terraces, or even one layer of them, could possibly be a reasonable alternative when it's effectively guaranteed to have the bluff go away.
Well, I mean, that's the Commission's position. That's one of the issues that's under appeal that DEP will be evaluating. The Commission can take any position they wish under their local bylaw appeal. But, I think, Helmut, that those are issues that DEP will be evaluating in terms of alternatives, adequacy of some of the alternatives in terms of providing the level of protection that some of the homeowners are seeking. So I don't think an answer to that question is going to be you're going to have an answer today.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
As I see, some people are leaving, and we're just going to have comments for another long while. I want to let you know that you can email comments to me. My name was on the sign-in sheet, but if you didn't write it down, it's Purvi, P as in pineapple, U, R as in Robert, V as in Victor, I, Patel, P as in pineapple, A, T as in Thomas, E, L as in library, at state.ma.us. You can find me afterwards to get this email address again, and you could approach the proponent or anyone that looks official and If you want the fax number also, or the address to mail, you can get that information from me. I will be here until the end. Okay?
Sure. So Jim did a great job answering there, but I'll try my best to answer your question. A little bit of the discussion that the commission had about alternatives that was brought forward. So during the notice of intent process and during the hearing process, and a lot of this information is still available online through PowerPoints, and Epsilon did a great job in breaking down some alternatives for the commission and putting it forward for some of the successes that have been had out here and some of the failures that have had out here from the projects historically. And the commission spent a great deal of time looking at alternatives and how alternatives behave. And one of the examples, obviously, is the case where we look, and you just brought up your property in the big episodic event that you had where you lost a lot of erosion. But one of the things the commission discussed and they went through when they talked about that was also the number of years where those terraces, while they needed to be maintained and regularly maintained, were still somewhat successful in providing protection to your bank and protection to that bluff. So when they look at alternatives, they're looking at those things and they're trying to draw from that information pool. I know Nantucket's a very diverse place and our coastal environment is very different from east to west and north to south. And we see a lot of structures come in that are for coastal protection, whether they're soft or whether they're more hard armaments, and alternatives are important. So it's something where when we can take real data and look at the real data that's been on sites, and the reports that the Woods Hole Group does for the transect surveys along here is also very helpful for the commission to have. And they can look at what's going on in sites and what's going on that's there and how things are behaving. And not everything, when you look at the function of structures, not everything is always perfect all the time. They're designed to function a certain way and they're designed to do things a certain way. And that's one of the things they have to take in consideration with alternatives and how they're behaving, and trying to find that alternative that's the least impactful and that also qualifies under the act and the bylaw to be permissive and can be conditioned to work. And I think the commission ultimately decided that in this case there were alternatives to what was proposed and what's currently on the ground that's there.
I have a question. Can you hear? Am I on? The gentleman sitting next to me has the fortune to be able to maintain the area in front of his house if the storms are not too frequently active. What happens when land where people run out of funds and are not able to maintain their areas that are not involved in this particular project? What are the ramifications of the other areas eroding at a much more rapid pace? I understand that the geotubes may have a life expectancy of 25 years. The people that are living here now probably will survive those 25 years. Who knows what's down the road, and how is such a structure supposed to be maintained in the future? Is it then the responsibility of the town, or is it are we constantly relying on the goodwill of the people who live here to maintain this extraordinarily expensive project?
DEP is not really, I mean, we will, if we issue a permit and there are ongoing provisions in that permit, such as, say, beach nourishment and monitoring, if those programs are not implemented, then the project could be deemed a failure, as Maria had discussed earlier, and it would require the removal of the geotube if failure criteria have been met. The issues of financing is not really a DEP issue. This site is a little unique in that the town of Nantucket owns a good portion of the beach where the geotube sits, and as a result, the Sconset Beach Preservation Fund needed the concurrence to file the NOI with the town of Nantucket. But in terms of financial obligations, that's not really an issue that DEP is going to address. That's something that has to be worked out amongst SB, PF, and the town of Nantucket.
Hello, John Osborne, 75 Baxter Road. The first comment that was made 3 or 4 ago was spoke my mind, I think. It was quite passionate and powerful about the broad picture. I just want to elaborate on that briefly. I would ask both the DEP and the CONCOM, in thinking about these issues, even though I appreciate there are a lot of administrative detail and process that you have to go through, in kind of trying to step back and think about the big picture, I would ask you to think about balance and consistency. So balance, I mean, the nature of all of these regulations, when you boil them down, is that we have an island that's extraordinary, and it's extraordinary for natural beauty and for historic buildings. We bought a house 10, 13 years ago, I guess. We kind of, at least the way I look at it, we've saved it twice. We renovated a 1923 bungalow, and then we moved it back this last winter. And we don't own the property across the street. We don't have a lot of alternatives. I think the broader spirit of all of these rules really is to try to reconcile these interests. And so I would issue that plea to each of these bodies to think about that. And you've suggested you will, but I want to make that point. Consistency. I don't have encyclopedic knowledge of everything that's happened on the island over the years, but I am aware of the fact that there have been, in different locations, hardscape approved, whether it's marine mattresses or other things. There certainly have been permits issued to allow for vegetation. Many of the things that have been either modified or rejected here on the bluff, again, in the context of this extraordinary resource and the context of this challenging environment, have been allowed in other areas, not just in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but on Nantucket Island. And Jim, you know better than I do, administrative law requires that there's consistency in the process. So I would urge you all to think about that.
Thank you. Sorry, can I just ask one follow-up question to the CONCOM member who spoke earlier? Oh, thank you. And I appreciate the efforts that the CONCOM has put in. I think it's wonderful what you guys do, and you do it on a volunteer basis. I'm just curious to literally follow up on the, the storm that took away 30 feet of bluff. And, I was just calculating if the lot is 100 feet wide approximately, I don't know, and if it's 30 feet of bluff that went away, in terms of yards, that would be 30 yards by 10 yards. And then if you want cubic yardage, it's another 20 yards down. So 30 by 10 is 300 times 20 would be 6,000 cubic yards. And you were talking about, well, how much mitigation do we need for the 100-year storm? And my concern is just that if this is nourishing the rest of the island all the way to Great Point and all the way around, I don't think we got a great benefit from those 6,000 cubic yards of sand that went away in one storm. 30 feet of bluff, it's 10 yards, times 30 the other way, times 20. If that's 6,000 cubic yards of sand gone, I just don't think we use that very effectively, but I just wanted to put the numbers out there. Thank you.
So, hi, I'll be brief, Steve. My name's Jim Walker. My wife, Deborah, and I live just a few houses up at 104 Baxter. We also own the lot across the street at 101 Baxter. And I'd like to thank Chairman Atherton for putting the time in today. Rick is in the back. I'd like to thank CONCOM for taking the time. I think, Bam, your point is right. But I want to talk a little bit about the human interest here and what this project has done to our community. And I'm going to start with a story. We have neighbors that are in their 80s, and they live 3 houses up, or what's left of their house. The hurricane that came 2 years ago was well predicted. Media was covering it. I knocked on their door and I said, "Come stay with us tonight." And both he and his wife said, "No, we're going to stick it out." So I went back there about 7 o'clock and I said, "Please, come with us. Your house is only 10 feet away, God forbid." And they've been there a long time. They said, "Nope, we're going to stay." I went back over at 11 o'clock at night to try to pull them out, and they wouldn't go. So the whole human interest side of this gets lost in the technical details. And it's great to have MIPA and great to have DEP here to hear about all of the technical debate, but there's a human side of the impact to our community that gets lost. And the point was made earlier about some not having the resources to fight, to move their homes. And I've seen it, and I've seen it at least a half a dozen times. And what does it mean? It means that families are moving away from this part of Sconset. I can count 6. I know, Sarah, you're shaking your head, but there are 6 families, some of which no longer come here. The house to my right was owned by the headmaster of a prep school. The one right behind us, a professor. These are families that don't have the means. I've been coming up here for almost 20 years to Baxter Road, and I've seen them move away. I've seen the economic hardship. The point was made earlier about the tax base and what it means to Nantucket, the town of Nantucket. But there's a personal side to this that if you live here, you see that probably many of you don't. The quality of life. The family that bought the house to my right, I was on the phone with her in June because we're about, let's try to work together for reasonable projects, and if it means vegetating the bluff, then let's try to do that as homeowners. And she was asking me, how do you go about it? And I said, you know, first thing I do is contact Josh or Helmut. And she said, oh, wait a second. There's a drone flying above my house and my children are out in the yard. I have to go. I'm not making this up. We have drones flying above, monitoring the beach, and I know they're supposedly safe, but they don't fly other parts of the island. Quality of life, the hurricane that we had here in July 4th weekend, I ran up on the top of the bank after the next morning. It was a day like this, and I looked down and I saw Pete Kaiser down there checking the damage. And I saw a woman walking the beach. And Jim, this is a point for you. This is one of the most underutilized beaches on the whole island. There's really no public access unless you go down by the Sconset. So you rarely see people walking up here. And I go out every morning just about and look out. You know, it's a great fishing spot. I've seen one person walking the beach, and it was the morning after the hurricane. So I'm standing on the bluff, and I'm like, they have a camera. So I'm looking at a telephoto lens of me on the top of the bluff with a camera. So that's the other human side of this, which I think gets lost. And again, it's an impact to our community. The final point is, what can we learn from this 1,000-foot project? And this is where I say, you know, it's great to have the state involvement because you can set an example for other states. Florida spends hundreds of millions of dollars fighting erosion with beach nourishment. It probably wouldn't have worked here, but so be it. New Jersey is spending tens of millions of dollars rebuilding after Superstorm Sandy. The Long Island Beach community is doing their own beach nourishment project. They spent $30 million with the town and a private and some private funds, which is what our hopes were for this project. Because something you may not know, the sewer beds where, you know, the population of 70,000 people, when they go to the bathroom, all goes, is in Maya Comet. And the sewer beds, there's no politically, where's Rick? There's no political solution to move the sewer beds to any other place. They're less than 500 feet from the bluff's edge. So if this works here, this could work for future generations. The airport is at risk. Last year, the edge of the fence to the airport was hanging off the bluff at Nobadeer. I walked it myself. I haven't been back this year. So I really hope this is an opportunity to work with the town, especially given their status on the notice of intent, to come up with a solution. Our opponents have been very well organized You can go to the website and it says erosion happens, leave perfect alone. It's time that we as homeowners work together with either state officials or local officials and come up with a lasting solution that goes far beyond the people here in the existing generation. Thank you.
I just want to take a second just to kind of refocus on the 1030 standards, the coastal bank standards, as I referred to earlier. The standards state that, the issuing authority, shall allow a coastal engineering structure when required to prevent storm damage to buildings constructed prior to August of 1978. And that is also provided that there are no other feasible alternatives and that the project be designed to minimize adverse effects. So those are the really important standards, and that's why we've had a little bit of a discussion about alternatives as part of the regulations, and also discussion about minimizing adverse effects. One of the things I've learned from my experience at DEP, and it's pretty well documented in the scientific literature, is the impacts of hard stabilization on a retreating shoreline and how often you lose the beach out in front of it. So to me, a very critical component of this project, if it's allowed to remain, is the ongoing beach nourishment component. I think it's very important that that be done to meet the standards of minimizing adverse effects. And I just wanted to just refocus everyone's attention on those standards that the state has in the regulations, and just want to reemphasize that.
I'm Stephen Cohen. I'm the attorney who is the lead on trying to permit this project. I cannot tell you how many hundreds of hours I have spent on this, and I have spent a lot of time with the Conservation Commission, and I certainly appreciate your volunteer time on this. I think that what we have here is a commission that spent a lot of time reviewing something and just came to the wrong decision, and I think that what we've seen today is actually a very good example of why. In the general sense, the commission found that there were 16 standards that weren't met. But what we see here is maybe they didn't necessarily analyze them in the way that they were supposed to. And there were very good examples already given. So I'd like to just make a note of that so that the people who are here hearing it can understand what they have actually heard in some context. So, the standard of whether or not, how much sand mitigation you're supposed to be providing. The chairman of the commission suggested that we should be providing sand mitigation at the 100-year storm level. That is not the legal standard. That is not, he says if you're going to build to 100 years, you should supply to 100 years. That's what we heard. That's not the legal standard that's proposed and or implemented anywhere. The mitigation that was proposed is not only 1.5 times what is normally done. It was also designed, the proposal was also that if there's an impact, that it could be increased. There was no, you're locked in forever and we've made a mistake and we can't fix it. So I want everyone to understand that we were already proposing to over-mitigate with the idea that it could be adjusted. There was also an assessment that, a statement by the chairman that we couldn't have, the SBPF hadn't proved absolutely that there would be no adverse impacts because what we were doing is speculative. So of course, no one can overcome proving that something that hasn't been done, what the impacts will be. But what we have here is something that was designed to either be removed or altered if there were adverse impacts, but we were also designing to minimize impacts, which is the actual legal standard, not to eliminate it with a guarantee any adverse impacts. We've also heard that they can't consider anything outside the 100-foot buffer zone, which is just not true. The protection of pre-78 homes does not require that those homes be within the buffer zone, and that is not a standard that has typically been applied. The information that was supplied into the public record on this shows that there are something like 48 or 50 or more pre-78 homes on either side, and that you can show over 5,000 feet of protectable area that's currently in danger. There are some gap lots, there are some modern houses in there, but the protectable land The protectable homes are all there, and most of them aren't 1978 homes, they're 1878 homes. And I think that that is important for us to recognize here too. So the most stunning thing to me on this is that this idea that Quar or Jute could work as a alternative is something that should be tried first, as if it hasn't been tried right next door and failed. But what we've heard at the hearings and what we heard today was that it's okay because that holds up most of the time. It only fails every 8 or 10 years. Well, if the standard that the CONCOM is saying is that we're okay with something that lasts for 8 to 10 years and then fails, I'm happy for the DEP to review it that way, because that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is something that's feasible, not something that is designed to fail within what's a relatively short period of time. Those systems have the exact system that the Conservation Commission wants us to use instead is not only designed to fail and break apart during storms, but it's been proven to do that. And you know, that's fine if we are not going to actually protect anything. If we're just going to slow it down, but if we're actually going to protect something, then we need something that works, that lasts, but also provides the appropriate mitigation. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but the mitigation in this project is not only appropriate and adjustable and substantial, it's beyond anything that's ever been done in the other applications. But the CONCOM has approved much harder revetments, seawalls, marine mattresses in areas that have a lesser marine environment. This perhaps the English Channel is a tougher marine environment, but this is the bow of the ship into the Atlantic Ocean with the toughest marine environment you could find, and yet we're being asked to use what's essentially burlap sacks to protect it. But they just approved marine mattresses on Hinkley Lane. They're approving hard armoring in the harbor. But here, they want a softer solution. So what we have, in my opinion, is an inconsistency in the application, both in fact and an application of the law that is not a reasonable application. You know, you can't say you have to approve, the law doesn't require us to meet the standard that the CONCOM is actually holding us to. And I think that that's apparent in the record, and I think that's apparent in the comments today. Thank you.
At Conservation Commission meetings. We are here today with some of our consultants from Applied Coastal Research and Engineering to support the Conservation Commission's denial of the proposed project. We participated quite extensively throughout the public hearing process, which was about 6 or 7 months long, I believe, submitting multiple written comment letters as well as verbal testimony along with our consultants. I'm going to let John speak to some of our more technical concerns in a moment. I just wanted to briefly touch on some of our regulatory concerns for Jim and Purvy's benefit. The emergency certification that was issued by DEP and by the Conservation Commission was issued based on a set of standards that are specifically outlined in the Wetlands Protection Act for emergency certification projects. The notice of intent application and review process, which subsequently ensued and was required by the emergency certification, is based upon an entirely separate set of performance standards within the Wetlands Protection Act, and essentially is a different process, a separate process. And those performance standards are the ones that really evaluate the project for environmental impacts. And those are the performance standards that the Conservation Commission eventually based their denial on. So we've heard a little bit about the ability under the Wetlands Protection Act to construct coastal engineering structures to protect pre-78 buildings. The project area currently consists of mostly vacant lots, which under the Wetlands Protection Act are not eligible for protection. The 2 northernmost lots and the 2 southernmost lots of the current project area are vacant, and the 3 lots in the center contain pre-1978 buildings that could be eligible for protection. I'm aware that the state's letter that issued sorry, I'm squinting so much, it's very bright, I forgot my sunglasses. I'm aware that the state's letter that issued the emergency certification cited the protection of public infrastructure also as part of the emergency status of the project, but through the notice of intent review process, it's pretty clear that the standards in the Wetlands Protection Act don't allow for the protection of public infrastructure with coastal engineering structures. I'm not aware if there have been other state permits that have been issued for geotubes or hard armoring such as this to protect infrastructure. But it's pretty clear that that's not laid out in the regulations as they stand. Also, as was mentioned, the performance standards that allow for coastal engineering structures to protect the pre-1978 homes do require that there be no other feasible alternative. We've already heard a little bit about some of the more biodegradable designs that have been maintained adjacent to the project area. One thing I would say that I did hear the commission deliberate on significantly when they were discussing that as a potential alternative is the fact that that project that has been maintained has not been nourished nearly in the same way that the geotubes have been proposed to be, and that there could be alternative designs such as that with appropriate and adequate nourishment could function to protect the pre-78 homes. In addition, through the technical review that we've had from our consultants, we've determined that there will be additional adverse impacts to the adjacent resource areas and downdrift resource areas, and that obviously the bank as a sediment source will be adversely impacted, and the sediment won't be able to transport to the adjacent resource areas. Obviously, it's a huge bank. This bank provides so much sediment to the system, which is why if erosion is going to be prevented in this area, so much more sediment needs to be provided, so much more mitigation needs to take place, and it's much more challenging to get a project permitted in an area like this because it is such a significant sediment resource for so many other resource areas that depend on it as well. And I'll just turn it over to John for some more technical comments. Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Ramsey from Applied Coastal, as Emily had just said. I just wanted to touch on some of the technical issues and some of the reasons why we've had some issues with this project. I think first, so everybody's aware, Emily had mentioned the mitigation. I think one of the big concerns here is that the mitigation, the purpose of it is really not to preserve the beach out front here. It's to provide sediment to downdrift beaches. So that's one thing that everybody needs to understand. And with that, this beach is migrating back 5 feet per year. And that's going to continue to happen whether you mitigate for the appropriate volume or not. So with that in mind, we've looked at, obviously, the issue of the mitigation. The overall volume is one of the concerns that we have. Maria earlier had pointed out it's somewhere around 14 cubic yards per linear foot per year. There have been numerous estimates made by various SBPF consultants over the last 20 years. And I believe that 14 number is the lowest one I've seen over the last 20 years. Numbers have ranged anywhere from 26 down to 14. And so I'd just like to point out that this 1.5 times the amount required really doesn't have, as far as we're concerned, much validity. One of the reasons why we think, at least, that this number is so low recently is because of the mitigation that's been done. Helmut had pointed out his project. He's put in quite a bit of material. There's been quite a bit of material added to this beach. And what that ends up doing is biasing how much the bank erodes. And when you're evaluating how much the bank erodes, you're not really getting a true picture, likely, of how much material is coming out of there. So I think more work would certainly need to be done there. Another issue, and this is something Conservation Commission had pointed out briefly, was about the placement location of the material. They looked at this minor northeaster that had occurred this year, and a bunch of material was placed above that. And that, from the placement calculations, that would be available for transport. And obviously it's not. There's also fans that come down where the material is placed. They come down the bank, and it does nourish the bank, and that does a great job. But where that material is placed and the purpose of it, which is to be available for transport during any storm, is maybe not necessarily the best place to be on top of the geotubes, but rather in front or updrift or downdrift. One other question that, there's a bunch of questions have come up over the time. I believe there is still a debate as whether some of the beach material was actually used to fill the geotubes. And if that's the case, obviously that material needs to be mitigated in some other way because that is now trapped within the geotube system. And Steve, there's just another point. One of the things that Steve had brought up is that the mitigation could be more if proven so. I've been involved with dozens of these projects over time, and one thing I've never seen is once a mitigation volume is agreed to, it's never bumped up. because it's very, very difficult to prove beyond a shadow of any doubt, just like the proof is on the applicant now, that more is needed. It would be very easy for a technical person to argue, well, that wasn't because of us, that's natural variability, et cetera, et cetera. So, really getting that number right in the first place is really, really critical. Something the Concom brought up, temporary versus permanent. If you'd been to all the hearings, you would realize that while this is a joint application, the town's consultants always presented this as a temporary measure, just needed to abate the emergency so that they could look at other alternatives, including moving Baxter Road and having alternative access. That's something that they were looking into. Now, when SBPF and Steve were presenting, it was always presented as a permanent structure. And I think that really just needs to be resolved, that issue once and for all. If this is permanent, it needs to be evaluated as a permanent structure. If it's temporary and in 5 years it's going to come out and we have other alternatives to look at, that's a different whole way of looking at this. A question also came up, and I think this came up in the enforcement order by the commission, was the whole concept of the jurisdiction. This project was originally proposed above the mean high water line. It looks like, and there certainly is evidence as far as I'm concerned, that there was work done below the mean high water line, which brings in a whole series of other permits. I think the DP, I'm not quite sure if they've ruled on that yet, but I would be curious to hear about that. But I think it is a critical issue. And one of the critical issues it comes to is this project. We have a 900-foot long project right now. In public hearings, it's been talked about that this is the precursor to a 4,000-foot project in the future or larger. Steve had mentioned 5,000-foot potentially. And with that, if this requires other state permits, this has to fall under MEPA review. And MEPA review would look at that project from the state permitting standpoint, and you're not allowed to segment a project. You need to look at the project in total, as opposed to looking at this 900-foot section and then carving out and doing the next section, the next section, the next section as separate projects. The MEPA regulations do not allow segmentation of a project, so you really need to make sure that you're looking at that as well. And I guess with that, I'll leave it to the next commenter. Thank you.
No, I think it's fine right now.
I did want to respond to the question about the sand mitigation volume calculations, because I agree with John, that has to be ironclad. We have put every detail of the calculation here in the ENF. It's available. I agree with John exactly that 79 Baxter Road, because sand has been included in the system, that should not be included when calculating a retreat volume. And we never have included it for that very reason. The sand volume calculations were calculated specific for the lots included in this application. We calculated it 3 different ways. And all of our calculations were within about 10% of each other, but the one we went with was the highest. So I really want to make that clear. There was a comment made about we had previously used higher numbers. I have all of our historic numbers here in the ENF for the bank contribution, and it does get a little confusing. The volumes we have previously submitted for a bank contribution rate varied between 8 and 14.3. We're sticking with 14.3. For a different project, a nearshore component was added in that changed the overall volume. But if we are looking at bank retreats, again, everything we've submitted, it's in here. It's between 8 and 14.3. We're using 14.3. Our calculations included the devastating erosion from 2012 to 2013 when people were losing 30 feet of bank. And so in my mind, they're skewed upwards. They're more than what we've seen in the past based on our previous calculations, which are all in here available. In terms of the mean high water issue, I do just want to again stress that mean high water, high tide line, there's still water elevations. So where we see the water appear on the beach, it can be influenced by wave run up and wave setup, even on a calm day like today. So if you want to know for sure where those are, you need a survey. It needs to be done. The only photographs we have with survey stakes were done right at the beginning of construction. The high tide line was staked. At the beginning of the construction, we were working our most seaward. We were working on the lowest geotube, which is located the farthest seaward. We were excavating it. It was a big trench and a big stockpile. Later, we were working on the upper tiers of geotube, so we were moving Moving landward, there was still a trench for water, but that initial work did represent the seaward limit of work. We have survey stakes with photographs that show that we were above the high tide line, and the high tide line is about 10 or 15 feet landward of the mean high water line. So we do feel that we were working above the mean high water line at all times. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Dirk Roggeveen. I represent the Quidnet Squam Association. The Quidnet Squam Association is an incorporated homeowners association representing people in Quidnet and Squam, which is the property just north of here. So in some respects, it's like SBPF, which is an organization of Baxter Road and Sconset homeowners. It also is also home to more than 10 citizens. And I only raise that issue to put it on the record because their names will be on the written comments that we will be submitting additionally to my brief outline here. Quidnet Squam Association altogether has more beach frontage, probably more, I expect way more property value, and probably significantly higher tax contributions than the Baxter Road properties. So when those issues are raised, people who are concerned about their properties just to the north here are raising the same concerns that people here are.
Justice, how many feet? Excuse me, Justice, how many feet?
I'm sorry, I'm just north of here. Do are you familiar with Quidnet and Squam?
I am.
Okay, well then you know where they are.
Well, how far is it? It's right there. It's over a mile. Is that correct, Dirk?
I think Quidnet Squam does comprise over a mile of property. And so the impacts collectively on all of those properties from sand starvation would be significant. So that's exactly why I'm here. The Quidnet Squam Association asked me to speak so that their members wouldn't have to individually stand up. They didn't bring loud stickers. They're the quiet neighbors to the north, I think. Anyway, the resource area we're talking with right here is a primary headland. It's the primary headland for the east coast of Nantucket, and it contributes sediment to the north and to the south, as is generally understood. Interestingly, it's not specifically understood because Sconset Beach, when asked to present that information, was never able to break it down and said it was actually too confusing, which is in the record. After you leave the bluff, when you get to the areas north, and when you go south and around the island, you're talking about beaches, you're talking about dunes, you're talking about barrier beaches to Sacachapan, just north of here, and those resource areas are fed by sand from eroding headlands. That's how they function. And when people talk about geotubes as a solution to erosion in the future, although there may be limited circumstances where coastal erosion structures can be built to protect coastal banks, that same criteria does not apply to all of the land on Nantucket that's made up of beaches and dunes and barrier beaches. So it would have limited application. Now, specifically to the MIPA issue, there's a number of regional impacts beyond the scope of the wetland permit for this property. And I just raised the points so that they can be considered. There are the beaches not just adjacently to the north and south, but actually to the far north and south, because as the major contributing headland to the east shore, the sand from here is understood to go all the way up to Great Point, and then it wraps around, and you can see the sand plumes as they wrap around from aerial photographs. It also heads to the south, and since Sconset Beach Preservation Fund began contributing huge amounts of sand into the ocean, there has been some build out in Codfish Park and in Tom Nevers. If you head north, there is a U.S. Coast Guard lighthouse, a navigational system. I don't know who owns the property, whether it's the Conservation Foundation or not, but the lighthouse is certainly an aid to navigation. That is to the north, and the sewer beds for Sconset, not the ones out in my comment, but the sewer beds are around in Tom Nevers, and they are under, I believe, a DEP consent order dictating how far they must be from the water's edge or the beach back, and that is just to the north. And both of those resources, infrastructure resources, are potentially impacted by this project in the event this project doesn't perform correctly or it isn't conditioned adequately, and I think those need to be addressed. In addition, just to the north here, after the headlands go down and it drops down to lowland and dunes, you have a wide beach which is a nesting area and habitat area for piping plovers and least terns. And that area has to be fenced off. The beach itself, right down into the water, is fenced off every year in order to protect that nesting area. And any diminution of sand to that beach will take away from that nesting area. So there's a potential impact to endangered birds. The infrastructure to the north, Codfish Park, again, if that sand erodes, then we're right back to the situation we were about 12 years ago, where the sand was actually lapping across the road. And there'd be significant problems trying to provide emergency access to people in Codfish Park. And then another environmental impact that's outside of the wetland permitting is the enormous number, the hundreds and hundreds of truckloads of sand that have been driven through Sconset and over the town, over the roadways, which include the state-funded and maintained roads on the island. And that traffic has contributed noise and pollution and probably impacted on the life of the roads. So those are all other state interests that are impacted by this project. To the Conservation Commission superseding order request, I understand that the record of the Conservation Commission proceedings, including digital copies of all of the audio tapes and videotapes, have been submitted as part of the record, and I'm hoping that means they will be reviewed and we don't have to individually go out and resubmit them yet a second time because they are already before the state. I want to, if I have to do that, direct you specifically to the testimony of Jim O'Connell, who is a recognized expert in coastal processes, and he spoke before the Conservation Commission for quite some time on this project and raised concerns that were then reflected probably somewhat in the decisions of the commission. I want to speak to regulatory review briefly, not because regulations are technically more important than environmental resources or people's lives, but because those regulations, those technical regulations, have been created and revised over time in order to protect people's property, people's lives, and environmental resources. They're there for a reason. They're not just something that's in the way. They've been created with a lot of thought by a lot of people, and that's why the Commission works really hard at implementing them. The focus of the regulations, I know all of you who are wearing red stickers are concerned about coastal banks, but the regulations also speak voluminously to protecting other resource areas, beaches and coastal dunes, and specifically barrier beaches, because barrier beaches provide a totally different kind of storm damage prevention when they breach. And you know, the people to the north are concerned about the one on separating Sakatchepan, if that breaches, and what the impacts would be on all the properties inside. This was touched on briefly before, but I want to raise it for a different reason. There's the sense that there was a bait and switch here, that it came in as an emergency permit with one set of standards, and then when the notice of intent was filed to regulate or the what had been permitted, instead of applying for the temporary geotube project that would be there just so long as it took for the road to be relocated, it changed into a different proposal, which was, I mean, it was somewhat, I didn't know whether they were being facetious or not. They said, well, it is temporary because the permits are only good for 3 years, so it's temporary. But that's the temporary nature of permits, not the temporary nature of the structure. And we all sat back in December in Mr. Posner's house when the emergency permit was discussed, and we all heard the representation at that time that this was a emergency project of limited duration on the beach, limited duration, not the permit being limited, the project being limited, so that the town would have time to relocate the road. And the state went there because the standards for emergency permits are to protect public health and safety. I mean, it's true that a pre-78 house is entitled to certain, within limits, coastal engineering protection under the law. But vacant lots and state public infrastructure, roads and whatnot, are not protected at that point. I mean, that's quite clear in the regulations. But they were allowed to be protected under an emergency permit because of the potential emergency impact on the houses that were outside of the jurisdiction. It doesn't mean that those houses are now part of the jurisdiction, or that the laws, the regulations have been changed. And under the regulatory schemes that's in the that's in the law and the regulations of the state, as well as the interpretation, most of this bank is not entitled to having coastal engineering structures in front of it. So the town, having represented that it was working to relocate the road, there are noises that are made sometimes about getting easements, but they're springing easements, and maybe they won't have to take effect unless, in fact, the road does go in, and so then it gets into a circular argument about which is to go first. And so the concern of Squidnet Squam, recognizing that this is going to impact up the coast and downdrift, is that, in fact, this does remain a temporary structure as represented. And there's been references to the law protecting pre-78 houses. It protects pre-78 houses from storm damage. It doesn't protect them from all other impacts. So the emergency access is not something that the regulations provide protection for. It's for storm damage protection. During the hearings, and there was multiple hearings that layered on top of each other because there's an outstanding application for a 4,000-foot rock revetment as well. There have been requests by Quidnet Squam as well as by the Conservation Commission, and we at Quidnet Squam never got the sense that despite the fact that they had collected data on transects, erosion data, there's been no modeling done. And so despite the fact that it's well understood that this contributes the sediment source north and south, and that the SBPF represents that putting sand on the beach will take care of the lack of sand contribution caused by the coastal engineering structure, there's been no modeling to show that that actually happens, other than to say, well, we expect it would cause erosion closer rather than farther. And in fact, we don't know that. The nourishment performance, rather than the amount, is part of the problem. It's been addressed earlier by other speakers with regards to the jute bags releasing sand during the storm event when it's most needed, not only to go into the system, but to actually cause the amelioration of the wave energy that's coming with the storm. Sand placement up on top of these structures provides nothing to the beach. And I was looking at pictures of seawalls in Massachusetts, and there's a bunch of seawalls up north near Boston where there's a seawall, no beach at all, just a couple rocks down below it, and then there's a roadway, and the seawalls there, obviously, they're historic, they've been there a while. But putting sand up on top of the geotubes in order to nourish the beach would be the same as putting sand up on top of the roadway in order to nourish the beach in front of the seawall beneath the roadway. It doesn't get there. It doesn't actually contribute. So just doing the addition and adding up the numbers and putting it down there isn't enough. The dynamics of sand contribution during a storm needs to be addressed. Future nourishment is a big concern, and I know you said how they pay for it isn't directly the concern of the DEP, but this is the mitigation that putting the coastal engineering structure causes harm. The mitigation is supposedly the solution to the harm. If the mitigation is make-believe or fanciful, in the sense of looking forward into the future, then it won't take care of the harm that's being caused. It would be like saying, if we're going to use a magic force field to keep the beach away, or keep the sand away, or keep the oceans away, and you say, what? There's no such thing. Show us how this is going to work. Well, Quidnet Squam Association wants to see how the beach nourishment into the future is going to work. Because it's nice to say it and say, well, it will be funded. But Sconset Beach Preservation Fund the corporation that's the applicant here has no assets in their corporate documents online. So it's not going to come out of SBPF per se. There's been talk about betterment districts, and so that the people here would fund it. But my research into betterment districts found no support for the idea that you can make long-term maintenance costs something that is incorporated into a betterment district. Only capital costs can be taken. So the idea of a betterment district solving this problem is a canard. And I do not believe that town meeting during the winter on Nantucket, when we're doing tax appropriations, you're going to find the taxpayers of Nantucket willing to appropriate the millions of dollars to purchase the sand and throw it in the ocean that would be required to protect this thing. So I think DEP needs to get a credible scheme or solution for long-term maintenance, not just saying, well, we're going to do it. And I know that there's a fund posted to remove the thing if it fails, but that opens a whole separate can of worms, and Quidnet Squam Association also has no faith in that and how that's going to function. Because if this project is nourished for 3 or 4 years, and then it stops being nourished, and then damage starts occurring to the beaches to the north, and Concom wants this thing removed, the permitting to remove it will be difficult also, and it will have to be applied for. We need to file a notice of intent in order to remove this coastal engineering structure, a lot of which is now covered by a bank that is slumped down onto it as it regained its natural angle of repose. And I don't see Sconset Beach Preservation Fund or the town of Nantucket being particularly willing to file such a notice of intent to do the work, much less find a way to appropriate the funds to do it. So it becomes a political battle. And political battles are great, and they're great fun for politicians, but it doesn't help the environmental concerns that DEP should be working at protecting to the north.
I don't mean to be rude. I'm trying to get a sense of how many people still want to comment.
How many are still awake?
I need to be at a site visit at the police department at 1 p.m. So I just need to know 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. The jute bags have performed really well up on Helmut's property. They don't fail every time there's a storm. They work every time there's a storm. The sand is released. The sand goes into the system during the storm. It does all the things it's supposed to do to protect downdrift beaches. And it does need to be reassembled and rebuilt after the storm. That's how it's supposed to work. It's like bike helmets, how they crush in and then you throw it away after your bike accident. You don't use it again. It's like bumpers on the front of cars that crumple in and protect you from dying. Yes, you need to replace the front of the car. But the jute netting has worked. It functions well. With the addition of the nourishment that they've proposed for this project, it would work perhaps better, Mr. Weimar. And when the storms, 2 consecutive storms or something, were so powerful that they actually got through all of that, and then were to the point where they were taking down the bank, such a storm also will have denuded all the sand off of the front of these bags. And this bag will be a vertical wall to the ocean in such a situation. So anything that impacts that like that will impact this even worse, because this is a vertical wall that's now been built out halfway down between the bank and the existing beach at the time. And it will cause all of the damage that not only experts already up at DEP, but the experts who testified at the Conservation Commission have spoken to. Thank you.
So my name is Gerard Ruddick. I'm at 6 Bayberry Lane, just down the road. I'm not really into the hypotheticals or the potentials. I guess my point that I would like to make is that the system is in place now. It's been in place for less than 8 months, and it's an opportunity to collect the data that this gentleman and others have so desperately asked to have, and the modeling that he wants to have. I think the time needs to be allowed to be able to develop that. And we talked about the storm in March. That was one storm. I have no idea of how that was relative to other storms. So to try to draw conclusions from one storm or from 8 months of an experience where we haven't had the opportunity to really see more of what this can do and test it, I think is short-sighted. I think the other thing to Doug Keppel's point earlier about analysis paralysis, we've seen it a bit here. We talk a lot about technicals. We don't then talk about the vegetation that's needed on the bluff that can certainly help stem the tide of erosion as well. That makes no sense for it not to be done. None. So we talk about the scary stories, but we don't do anything about the smart things that we could be doing right now to try to stop this right behind me from happening. So I guess I would just ask to give it more time and also to do the smart things that are obvious, staring us right in the face. Thank you.
Kyle Latchaw, 113 Baxter. I'm not a scientist nor a lawyer, so I'm not here to debate those points. My science is my eyes. We have not seen any impact on the geotubes at our property since they have been installed, let alone whether it's Squam. Now, we're maybe a quarter of a mile down the road. We've seen nothing. So that's one point. Also, as far as the beach, in our over 10 years, we have never seen one person swim on this beach. As Mr. Walker explained, it's rare if you even see anyone walking. Also, what we do know is, as you see right now, Baxter Road is hugely, hugely traveled. And I would invite anybody to come out and spend a day, bring a sandwich, and watch. We have some work being done on our house. The people that have been here 30 years or more had no idea that Baxter Road is such a busy place, whether it be the bikers, the baby carriages, all that I know has been revisited many, many times. Baxter Road, as well as this area, are the important things, including all the other things we've heard about, the taxes, etc. And on another different subject here, I, for one, find it very offensive that the Squam people, and particularly Mr. Rogovine, and we heard it this morning, mentioned things about buying stickers, or we even had to all sit through a hearing where we were told that most of us won't be around in 15 or 20 years. I find that very offensive. And as the DPA, and it's not funny, I find the DPA or MEPA probably doesn't realize that as little ago as last week, a very inflammatory letter appeared in the paper saying that these had been compromised and that there were huge pieces found on the Mattocket Beach with no proof at all. What it involved is Concom, the harbor master, a number of other people had to go out and verify that it was not from here. I, for one, am tired of the below-the-belt comments that get made on a regular basis against the people on this side of the island. You all don't know what a resource Baxter Road is. The lighthouse, I mean, the walking. Daily, people use this. You don't see people running along the dirt roads in Squam. You don't even see them downtown. This is the important thing right here. That's all.
Mary McAuliffe, 72 Baxter. I just have two things to say. One, Mr. Rogovine, I was at the Concom meeting, one of them, and you spoke for us, Quidnet and Squam, and you spoke again today, and I can't decide really where you are. Are you really against us or for us? Because you start out being against us, and then you say all these things we could do to make it better. So that's one thing. And number two, I have friends who live in Quidnet and Squam, and I would love for them to think that we were neighbors and friends and support us and try to help us. We're trying to save our homes. Thank you.
Josh Posner, 77 Baxter Road. I'm not going to go into
the details and the technical aspects. What I want to point out is we have maybe not the catchiest phrase in the world, but we have our stickers that say, "Retreat will not save Sconset." When you boil down all of the discussion and all of the comments, as far as I'm concerned, from people who've opposed our efforts, it comes down to saying that the only truly responsible action that we should be allowed to take as people who live here is to move our homes, is to retreat. Sometimes there'll be a comment about you could put in, take the jute or the coir bags. They will buy you a little bit of time in order to adjust. That is not what the law provides. The law provides that we have a right, if we are protecting a historic community, to defend ourselves, to protect our homes. We have gone the extra mile to do this in the most environmentally responsible way that we can possibly come up with and still protect our homes. If the only thing that was important was to protect a natural beach, to protect the literal system, then yes, we should not be allowed to protect our homes. But that is not what the law provides. The law provides that we can protect our homes as long as we're doing it in a manner that is well designed and that is appropriate and fits in with the environmental criteria. We have gone the extra mile. We have gone way farther than that in order to try and accomplish that. It seems to me that I consider myself an environmentalist. I've been involved in supporting environmental causes for my entire life. This is not environmentalism versus people who don't care about the environment. We have done this in the responsible way, in the appropriate way, and in the legal way. And we should be, I think, held up as a standard for how to find the right balance. Thank you.
Hi, Tom Tuttle, 65 Baxter. Just tell a quick story. I know you've heard some stories here today already. I moved to Baxter Road about 5 years ago. My grandmother, who's 103, started coming to Sconset in the 1920s, but she hadn't been here for 30 years. And I brought her out last summer to come out, and the first thing she wanted to do when she said coming back to Sconset after such a long time was go do the bluff walk. And so we got halfway down the bluff walk, and it ends. And she asked, what's going on? How can this be? In the 1920s, this was the thing to do. There was no TV, there was no radio. You'd come to Sconset, you'd go to the casino, you'd see a play, and you'd go and do the bluff walk. And she was shocked that the bluff walk was half as long as it was going to be, and she was scared that in not a whole lot longer there'd be no bluff walk left. And we haven't talked much about it. People worry about their homes, but the bluff walk's already half gone. This is irrecoverable, what has happened to it right now. And it's something that's been around for nigh on 100 plus years, and it's been a benefit to the community. It's something that people have done for a very long time, and it was horribly disturbing to her to find that we'd allowed it to disappear.
Hi, I'm Bill Cohen, the owner of 81 Baxter Road. I'm the author of the last summer's Vanity Fair article about the erosion on the bluff here. I'm here with my son, Teddy. I can just tell you one thing, Mr. DEP and Miss MIPA, that if we don't do anything, my house is going to go away. I moved it this past winter. It's at the edge of the road now. There's nothing more I can do. I don't own any property on the other side. If we don't solve this problem, my house is going to go away. My sons are not going to be able to enjoy it, and that's going to be the end of it. So I'm like baffled in my mind why when people voluntarily want to use their money to try to solve a problem that is in compliance with laws that we have the right to do, that it's denied by town officials. And I'll leave you with one other thought is I've seen Bill Belichick run along this road many weekends this summer, and if you want to make it so that Bill Belichick cannot run on this road, I leave that with you, and that's on your conscience.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I think we should probably wrap up. Just wanted to reiterate, there's a lot of people here today, and some people may not have had an opportunity to speak, but your urge to write to MEPA, and their deadline is September 9th. Once the MEPA certificate is issued in mid-September, DEP would be free to issue a superseding order of conditions. We probably will do so, relatively soon after that MEPA certificate is issued. Written comment can also be submitted to DEP. I work in the Southeast Regional Office, and people can contact me or contact Jeff and get the address that you can send comments to me relative to the superseding order under the Wetlands Act. Once DEP issues the superseding order, it is subject to a 10 business day appeal period, by which the applicant, any 10 residents, or any abutter to the project site may request an administrative hearing. So I just want to let people know that there is an appeal process built into the department's decision making, and that is available. At this point, I think we're just going to wrap up. I know Purvi has to move on to another site, so we really don't have a lot of time for questions, but if you have one or two real quick ones, I could probably answer that.
Is there an email address that we should be sending comments to?
You can send comments to me by email. My email is jim.mahala, M-A-H-A-L-A, @state.ma.us.
Jim and I have the last part, the emails as the same, state.ma.us, and it's purvi.patel, Purvi.patel, Patel. And if you like, you can actually CC Jim or myself and include the comments. So he has them and I have them as well.
Just one second, Jeff. Just want to reiterate too, any comments that are sent to me by email or by written mail should also be copied to the Conservation Commission and to the proponent. So you should copy, I would say, Jeff Carlson on behalf of the Conservation Commission, and possibly Maria Hartnett at Epsilon, so that all parties have those comment letters and there's not a communication occurring just between DEP and an entity. Yes, and Maria, what's your email?
Very simple. It's M Hartnett, H-A-R-T as in Tom, N as in Nancy, E-T-T, at, and it's one long word spelled out, Epsilon Associates, E-P-S-I-L-O-N, associates.com.
Is there a deadline for comments?
I would say probably by like the third week of September, right around the same time that the MEPA certificate would be issued. Because once it's issued, DEP is going to act on it relatively promptly, probably within the next 2 to 4 weeks after the certificate.
So no comments to MEPA?
No, you can submit comments today all the way up till September 9th to MEPA.
Yes.
You can submit comments to DEP on the SOC review all the way up to the 3rd or 4th week of September.
So what normally happens is if there's multiple state agency action, MEPA needs to happen first. And what I'm just saying is if you want to CC Jim during the MEPA review, that would facilitate your submission of the comments to him prior to the SOC review. Okay, does anybody have any questions regarding the MEPA review process? No, with that, I thank you very much. I understand that you're all very passionate about your position on the project, and we will take your comments very seriously. So please do submit them by September 9th to our office. Thank you.
For my contact, and if you lose any of the contact information for Maria, Jim, or Purvi, you can find us at the Natural Resources Office down at 2 Bathing Beach Road. It's at the tennis courts in front of Jetties Beach. Our phone number there is 508-228-7230. Or you can always email me as well. It's a pretty easy one. It's just jcarlson, JCARLSON, at Nantucket, with the dash, ma.gov. So if you lose any of the other three, or you're just looking to get that in, you can come find me.
Thank you.
Hey, Dirk, it's not the trust fund. Right. I think you're sitting here making on the White House.
Great point.